Welcome to The Explainer. You know, when most of us think about energy security, our minds probably jump straight to domestic reserves, right? Or maybe the high-level boardroom diplomacy involved in securing big trade deals. But today, we are going to completely reframe that whole concept. We're going to stare straight into the reality of our maritime vulnerabilities. If you've always thought energy security is just about who we buy our oil from, well, this is going to change your perspective entirely.
Consider this staggering reality for a second. India imports roughly 85 to 89% of its crude oil demand, plus around half of its natural gas. And here's the real kicker, absolutely none of this massive volume comes through pipelines. Every single drop has to move across the open water. I want you to just keep that massive floating exposure in the back of your mind as we unpack this.
So, to make sense of this complex geopolitical puzzle, we're going to break it down into 6 specific areas today. First, the maritime energy reality. Second, diagnosing the land clasp syndrome. Third, choke points and maritime crises. Fourth, the shadow fleet illusion. Fifth, SPR versus Navy asymmetry. And finally, building a permanent posture. All right, Section 1, the maritime energy reality. Let's start with the hard truth about our actual vulnerabilities.
The core problem here is that energy security fundamentally isn't about statecraft or building national land reserves. Honestly, diversifying our suppliers just gives us an illusion of security, because the true risk sits out on the open ocean within the vessels themselves. I mean, think about it. It absolutely does not matter if we buy our oil from the Middle East, or Russia, or the Americas, if the hull carrying that oil is intercepted, mined, or denied insurance way before it ever reaches our shores.
Moving right along to Section 2, diagnosing the land clasp syndrome. To understand why policymakers keep missing this, we need to look at a specific academic framework.
This brings us to Dr. Pravakaran Pallari's National Security Framework, and he defines this brilliant core concept called ocean advantage. Basically, this is the total utility value of the ocean for transport, trade, energy, and logistics, and it sits squarely inside the maritime terrain of national security. So, according to this framework, an erosion of energy security isn't just some logistical supply chain headache. No, when ships can't move freely, it is a fundamental failure to maintain this ocean advantage, which instantly makes it a severe national security threat.
And this perfectly highlights our core vulnerability. According to Dr. Pallari, India suffers from something called land clasp syndrome. It's basically this dangerous systemic bias where we heavily favor terrestrial safety nets, things like building storage tanks and relying on state diplomacy, while entirely neglecting the maritime instruments that actually matter. We're talking sovereign flag tankers, standing naval escorts, robust maritime insurance pools. We are literally obsessing over the land while the actual variables governing life or death risks are floating out on the water.
Let's look at Section 3, choke points and maritime crises. If you want to see this land clasp syndrome in action, we just need to look at what we've had to navigate this very year.
Let's trace the precise timeline of the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, because it's incredibly revealing. On February 28th, right after coordinated strikes on Iran, the strait was declared closed, and that was aggressively backed up by merchant ship attacks and mining. Tanker traffic basically collapsed overnight. Now, there was a brief ceasefire in early April, which allowed for some evacuations by late June, but by early July, the closures and violent strikes were right back. It shows this repeating structural exposure that collapsed the world's most critical energy artery twice in a matter of months.
I really want to emphasize the human and logistical cost here, because it is staggering. At the absolute worst point in the Western Persian Gulf, India's DG Shipping reported at least 22 Indian-flagged vessels and over 600 seafarers utterly trapped, stuck. And to make it worse, war risk insurance premiums just skyrocketed. Multiple global underwriters pulled their coverage completely. So even if a ship's captain wanted to risk the journey, legally and financially, they couldn't. You have real people and billion-dollar assets completely paralyzed. And the crazy thing is, this exposure isn't even isolated. We are facing compound threats across multiple corridors all at once. Look at the Red Sea. Houthi attacks since 2023 have forced ships to take the vastly longer, incredibly expensive route all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. Because our 2 main western corridors can fail simultaneously, they can't act as backups for one another. And if you look east to the Strait of Malacca, which is where all our vital LNG imports flow, that corridor is flanked by Chinese-linked port investments at Gwadar, Hambantota, and Djibouti. A disruption there would instantly sever the other half of our supply chain.
Which perfectly cues up Section 4, the shadow fleet illusion. It's time to tackle a massive misconception about source diversification.
So, since 2022, Russia has actually become India's single biggest crude supplier, making up about a third of our imports. Now, on a spreadsheet, this looks like brilliant, sensible source diversification. But honestly, it hides a massive, unchecked carriage risk. We are successfully solving the problem of who sells us the oil, but we're completely ignoring the maritime terrain where the physical vulnerability actually lives.
Because a huge chunk of this Russian crude is moving on what's known as a shadow fleet. We're talking aging, poorly maintained ships operating entirely outside mainstream Western classification, tracking, and insurance systems. Just to give you an example, in June 2026, France boarded the tanker MT Deliver, which had loaded at a main Russian Baltic terminal. That was the 5th boarding of a suspected shadow fleet vessel in under a year. It proves the point perfectly. Diversifying your sources means absolutely nothing if the ships and their shadowy insurers lack the credibility to survive international scrutiny or a regulatory boarding.
Now for Section 5, SPR versus Navy asymmetry. Let's dig into how this land bias creates massive structural flaws in our defense budgeting.
Look at this glaring disparity. India's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, our SPR, only covers roughly 18 days of consumption. That is miles behind the International Energy Agency's recommended standard of 90 days. It's kind of like your smartphone battery completely dying by 9 a.m., but honestly, the deeper issue is that even if we spent billions to fill the SPR to that 90-day brim, it only buys us time. It's a band-aid. It manages the fallout after the exposure is already hit, but does absolutely nothing to remove the maritime risk in the first place.
We are vastly overweighting our landside responses. Policymakers are constantly throwing funding at the SPR, at source diversification, at diplomacy. Meanwhile, we are completely under-resourcing the maritime instruments that are actually required to keep supply chains alive in active war zones. We lack a sovereign tanker fleet. We lack dedicated naval escorts. And crucially, we lack strong domestic P&I, or protection and indemnity insurance clubs, which are these massive mutual insurance pools required to underwrite the astronomical financial risk of sending a ship into a conflict zone.
And this asymmetry leads to a frankly unacceptable reality. The SPR gets all this endless policy attention and funding debates, right? Meanwhile, the Navy, the actual entity doing the urgent, dangerous work of keeping ships and crews alive in active combat zones, lacks any institutional standing for this specific commercial role. They literally do not have a named, dedicated budget for the next maritime supply crisis. Naval escorts are just scrambled together after the fact as this emergency patch. We treat the land-based responses seriously and treat the maritime reality as an afterthought.
So bringing us to our final section, Section 6, building a permanent posture. How do we systematically cure this vulnerability? We actually have 4 highly specific solutions here. First, a top priority government push to expand our Indian-flagged sovereign tanker capacity. We have to close that carriage gap. Second, we must aggressively scale up the Bharat Maritime Insurance Pool. It was created as a reactionary stopgap when foreign insurers fled mid-crisis, but it's currently capped at a mere $100 million. A single loss of a fully loaded supertanker could easily exceed that ceiling, meaning we desperately need a full-scale, globally recognized domestic P&I club. Third, establish standing naval protection. And fourth, increase domestic offshore exploration in the Krishna Godavari and Andaman basins to help manage long-term demand. Zooming in on that naval protection for a second. Past deployments like Operation Urja Suraksha absolutely prove that active naval escorts are incredibly effective at deterring attacks. But we cannot treat this as some temporary ad hoc mission anymore. We have to transform these reactionary escorts into a permanent, well-resourced baseline posture. Strategically, that means anchoring our defense on the Andaman and Nicobar Command in the east and maintaining a permanent Gulf presence in the west. Ship owners need to be able to rely on this as a daily guarantee, not just pray for it during a massive emergency.
The ongoing Hormuz crisis finally settles a debate that ran on mere hypotheticals for years. Our top national security priority simply cannot be more diplomacy or just building more storage tanks. India already manages those land-based levers pretty well. The priority has to be permanently governing the risk right where it starts, at sea. We have to convert these temporary, panicked reactions into a permanent, unshakable maritime posture.
So I want to leave you with this final, critical thought. Will Indian energy security finally establish a permanent maritime posture, or will we just continue to leave our entire economy at the mercy of foreign insurers and choke point conflicts? Based on Dr. Polari's framework, until we cure our land class syndrome and truly invest in securing the ocean terrain, whose hands are really on the wheel of our national security? It's a reality we absolutely can no longer afford to ignore.
Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this permanently changes how you look at the energy powering our lives.